CSS Grid is one of the most important features in CSS. You know, when you're doing a layout, you have different kinds of layout techniques. You could use float, you could use positioning, you could use flex, that is flexbox, and you can use CSS Grid. And CSS Grid is one of the most robust, one of the most highly featured CSS property for layout. And one of the interesting things you might find is that even though you know how to use CSS Grid with normal CSS, you know how to write it, or you don't, one of the things I want to point out is that when it comes to CSS Grid, different page builders, you know, they implement it in different ways. So if you have used CSS Grid in another builder, you could come into another builder and you may have some difficulties, you know, finding out how to use it there, except you really understand the basic fundamentals of CSS Grid. This video is aimed at showing you how to use CSS Grid in Oxygen Builder, specifically in Oxygen Builder. So how is this implementation done in Oxygen Builder? So I'm going to show you everything you need to know about CSS Grid in Oxygen Builder. The first thing I want to point out is that CSS Grid allows you to arrange your elements, your items into rows and columns. So those are the two concepts you need to keep at the back of your mind, rows and columns, because you're going to be using it a lot. For you to implement CSS Grid on any elements, there has to be two elements. That is the grid container, the CSS Grid container. I have a couple of elements here. I have a div here and I have some divs inside this parent div. So the parent div is the grid container, and then these cards in here, they are the grid item. So you have the grid container and then you have the grid item. So you need to have those two things to be able to use CSS Grid. So that means for you to set up your grid, you need to put your divs inside a parent. So these are the cards, 1, 2, 3, and then this is the parent. Now for us to turn this into a CSS Grid layout in Oxygen Builder, you're going to select the parent and then you're going to go to the left panel under the primary tab, and then you're going to click on grid. Now we have vertical and horizontal. These are actually flexbox layout. The third one here is grid. So this is the CSS Grid. So what you do is that you're going to click on that, and once you do that, CSS Grid is activated. After doing that, you have to determine the number of columns that you want. So how many columns do you want? You don't have to worry about the row, just the columns. So now you have a column count here. Now I want this to be 3 columns, so I'm going to just put the number 3 there. So we have our 3 columns. Now let's do something. What if I wanted 2 columns? I'm going to put 2, or I could just use this slider to move it to 2. Now you notice that this div, you know, does not span the whole width of the screen. I mean, that is depending on how you want to use it. If you just wanted it to be the width, you know, the natural width of these cards, that is fine. But for most use cases, you want it to fill in the, you know, the section container. And to do that, you have to go to the width, okay, of this CSS Grid and give it 100%. I mean, this applies to even if you want to use Flexbox, you want this, the parent container to fill its parent width, except that is not your goal. If you want it to fill just 50% of the width, it's going to fill up, you know. But in my use case, I want it to be 100% of the width of its own section. All right, so we have this and we want it to be 3. Okay, so I'm just going to move this to 3 and we have 3 columns. The next thing you're going to do here is this minimum width refers to the minimum width of each of the cards. So this means now the default value is 200. Now this means that this card cannot shrink below 200 no matter what. Now leaving this at 200 with the current settings that we have might result in some overflow situation. Now I will recommend that you always leave this at 0. Now there are situations where you want to put a value here, but for now always leave it at 0. So we have that, we have 3 grids, and then the maximum width is 1 FR. Now the FR means fraction. So 1 FR means 1 fraction. That's what it means, or 1 fractional unit. So each of these is 1 fraction. So you have 1 fraction, 1 fraction, 1 fraction. So to give it a maximum width of 1 fraction is the default, which is how you should let it be. So don't tamper with that. Okay. Now I want you to take note that in Oxygen, when working with CSS Grid, you don't ever have to touch the children elements. You don't need to do any settings on the child elements. All the settings are from the parent element, which is basically sort of a brilliant idea. Maybe there are some, you know, pros and cons to that, but for the most cases, it just gets the job done. For 99% of the cases, this is just the perfect, setup that you will ever need, because everything is just on one panel on the parent. So every setting that you need will be here. Now, so we have dealt with the minimum width and the maximum width. The gap by default is 20 pixel. So I don't know why rem is here. Maybe it's because I'm using RECODA. It's just showing the default, but it's 20 pixel actually. Now you could always change the gap. Maybe I want it to be 50 or I want it to be 0. But generally you might just want to leave it at the default for now, unless you specifically want to give it a gap. So now the next thing I want you to look at is, let's jump all the way. Let's ignore this for now. The row behavior, leave it. The default settings is almost always what you want to do. Now we have a situation where the grid cards, some of them are taller than some because they have more content. You have to come to the vertical item alignment, and then you're going to click on stretch. Okay, so when you click on stretch, you see it's going to stretch and fill up the remaining space. I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go to the front end and see what is going to happen. So let it refresh, and then we have a very nice CSS grid layout. Now there are other settings here. You have the default child span, column and row span. Okay, you have child span override. Now under the child span override, you're going to see 3 elements here. Now these 3 elements represent the children, and these elements you see here are dynamic. They change depending on the number of the children. Now we have 3 children here. That's why you see 3 of them. If I come here and duplicate this, and let's go back to the parent, you're going to see that we have 4 of them right here. Okay, so this will always show you the number of grid item, that is the grid children that are on the canvas. Now the reason we have this is we use this to override the child span. So if I click the first one, you're going to see a new field, 2 new fields. One is column span and the other one is row span. Remember what I said from the beginning, the 2 concepts you need to pay attention is columns and row, because there are times you want your grid items to be more than 1 row or 1 column, to span 1 row, or to span up to 2 row, or to span up to 2 columns. Now if I want this first grid item to span 2 columns, I'm going to come to the column after clicking it here. Okay, see it's highlighted, it's selected. I'm going to come here and say I want it to span 2 columns, because right now each of them are 1 column. I'm going to come here and click 2, and then it will span 2 columns. Now this first grid item has spanned 2 columns, but it's still 1 row, because the first and the second one, they're on the same height, so it's spanning only 1 row. Now if I want it to span 2 rows, if I put 2 here, you're going to see now that it spans 2 rows. Now the reason is like this is this large, okay, stretches all the way, is because of the image. Okay, so the image, if I click on this image is set to be 100% width. If I just set it to be auto, you can see that it's actually it's spanning 2 columns and 1 row. Now if you want this image to fill up this, okay, basically if you want that kind of layout, you probably will use a background image. Okay, so let's say we wanted this image to fill this up. You have a layout that you want to have, you need it to be, because once you set this image to be 100%, it's going to grow. Okay, so once that image is set to be 100% like that, it's going to grow. If you really want to use an image, probably you could just set a height on it, something like that. But for the most of the time, you want to set maybe a maximum height for the image. But this is not about this type of layout. If you wanted to do something like this, you probably will just maybe use a background image. But what I'm trying to say here is, let's go back there. So this spans 2, okay, and like I said, if you have a situation like this and you want it to move all the way, you can put 2 here so that this moves in and fills up. Now if I go to the third one, I said okay, let that third one span all 3 rows all the way to the end. I can select it, 3 columns, and it's going to fill up all of them. And like I said, if you don't want it to be this large, okay, so you want to control the height of the image, you might just put that image on auto. Okay, but then if you want to fill this up, perhaps let's say if we take away this image and then we put it as a background, okay, I'm going to select that ID, I'm going to go to the background and then select maybe just a background, something that is good for a background, something like that. And then we see we have a background, and if you're going to have a background like that, then you have to give it a minimum height of, let's say, just give it a minimum height, let's say a 200 pixel, or depending on the test, 300 pixels. So it depends. So let me go back to that image and just center it. Okay, now repeat. Okay, make this 50%. All right. Okay, so you can see that we have it. So even if we have that, if we had that kind of div here, okay, you'll see that we will not have a situation whereby if we wanted this first one, okay, let's go back to the first one, to be just one row, okay, it's not going to fill up, it's not going to grow all the way like this. So if I go there and remove this image, you see, and I go ahead to give that a minimum height. Okay, let's go to the ID. Yep, so I'm going to go here, size and spacing, I'm going to give it a minimum height of 350 also. Okay, and then if I want to give it a background image, perhaps I could just give it a background image like so. Okay, cover, and we have a grid. Okay, so we have these, let's look at that. We have this one is 2, this one is 1. Okay, so that is the third one. And if I take that and duplicate it twice, so now we have a situation where we have this spans 2, and then this 1 each, and then this spans 3 columns. And of course, for layout, anything that has to do with layout, you have to figure out how to solve, because the grid has done its job. Now you want to, okay, I want all my cards to be the same. This and this, they have a specific height. So why is this, like that? So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to take away, I'm going to go to the advanced layout and take away that minimum height, okay, from there, and do the same thing here. I'm going to go there and take away the minimum height. Now this image wrap has a specific, it has a specific class for all of them. So I could go to that class, okay, and then give it a minimum height, say 200 pixel, and it doesn't seem to do anything. Let's take it up to 300. So the minimum height is 300, but it doesn't seem to affect anything. So if I come here and give it 100%, you see, before we give it a minimum height, it works. Okay, so now, but you see that we have this one is also, it's the same class, so it takes up that minimum height also. Okay, so let's say we wanted that minimum height to be 250. So I'm trying to get something as close as possible to the height of this, this image. Now, if you had a situation where your minimum height is supposed to be, let's say 250, and you had this image in here and that is not growing into fill it, you could always go in and set the height of the image to 100%, and it's going to fill that in. But make sure that your object fit to the image is set to cover. Okay, actually, we don't need that height to be 100%. Now, the reason that is not, for some reason, it's not showing in the builder. I'm not quite sure. But if we go to the front end, it should show properly, because once you have that height, okay, so it's going to show. So you can see that the image wrapper, has the same height. So all of them, you have consistent height, even though in the builder, it doesn't seem to show. I guess it's probably an oxygen issue. Okay. Minimum height of 250 is not working. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just select this to none. Okay. And try to override that oxygen. Okay. I'm going to put none there. Okay. I want to type important. I just want to see something. Okay. And let's put pixel. All right. So putting that now, by default inside the editor, oxygen overrides the minimum width. I think it does that on the ID. Okay, I'm not sure. Probably does it on the class. Yeah, it does it on the class for the div element, and that is why it's not showing up in the back end. Okay, so for it to work, I had to put this here. It's important here. So I think it's something that the oxygen team should take a look at, because that minimum height of 80 pixel, that is the default for all divs, is overriding the value here when I use it on the class. Okay, so it only overrides it if it is on the class. See, on the class, it doesn't override it. But if I use the ID, it works. But now I want to set it on the class, so it's not really showing on the class. So I also want to point out that one of another way you could deal with this, let's remove that important and remove that minimum height. Another way you could deal with something like that, if you have a background, okay, a background image, like this is an image and this is a background image. So what I'm going to show you only works if all of them are background images. Okay, so another way you can deal with that is to set padding. So let's say so I'm going to use the top padding. Okay, I want to set a 50% padding to the top, so you can see it gives it now, like I said, you do this for items that have just background images. I think it applies, yeah, it applies to all of them. Okay, but if you want to give it in, let's say I'm going to make it this 250 pixels instead. So instead of having a minimum height, so I give it a padding of 250 pixel, and that, you know, solves the problem. But then of course you can see that here we needed to have just the background images and not an image. So you can see, so this only applies if you're using only background images. But since we are not using background images, so what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to take that out and go back to this. But I actually prefer writing it in the custom CSS section, which I'll just say minimum height, okay, 250 pixel. You're gonna put the word important there. Okay. All right, so that that works. Okay. All right, so I hope you're picking up a couple of other things, you know, while we're learning CSS Grid, a couple of other things. All right, so that is all for, you know, using the regular settings. Now we want to move on to the next setting, which is the Autofeed. Now, but let's move into responsiveness before going to the Autofeed. Now, what do you do? Now let's do responsive. So if you go here, this still looks good. Here, this still looks okay. But here we said we don't want our grid container. We don't want the grid layout, the grid columns to be 3. We want 2 at this breakpoint. So what you're going to do is that you're going to activate the grid again, and then you're going to see those settings that we carried over from the larger breakpoint here. So we say, okay, we want 2. Okay, so I'm going to move this to 2. But you see that we're still having some, you know, issues here. So let's go down to the child element and see what is going on. So here we have that this spans 2. Now this just 1. Now this and this and this spans 3. So we see where the problem is, because we have 2 columns, but we're asking this to span 3. So we have to take it back to the highest number of columns, which is 2. Once we do that, you can see everything falls in place. This span 2, and this is fine because there are 2 columns now. These 2, now this is 1 1 each, and then these 2. Now when you move to the next and you decide, okay, I don't want, maybe you still like it the way it is, but if you don't want it from here, you say I want everything to be 1 column each. You have to activate it again at that breakpoint and then take it to 1, and then you have to go to these, go to the first one, reset it to 1, go to the anyone that is more than 2. Okay, anyone that is more than 1, you reset it, and once you reset them, everything becomes normal. So that is how to set up the responsiveness. But there is a way to make this automatically responsive. Now, if you want to make this automatically responsive, so I'm going to save this. Once again, let's look at the front end and see how it looks. Front end, I'm going to do that, and you can see that everything is fully responsive. Of course, it looks like it's a little bit too big at this breakpoint, okay, to be 1, but that is just what we did. Now, so what we're going to take a look at now is how do we make this automatically responsive? Let's say you don't want to go in breakpoint by breakpoint and making these changes. Go into these one after the other, okay, and just undo what you did, okay? Okay, just undo what you did, undo what you did, undo what you did, okay? Just like that. So we undo that, so we don't have any styles here, okay, here and here. All right, now to make it automatically responsive, I would recommend not using this kind of layout. Okay, if you're using this kind of layout, then it defeats the whole purpose, because you will still have to go back to the breakpoint and sort out these column spans. Okay, so we want to reset everything. So I'm going to come here and then I'm going to reset the grid children. Okay, So I've resetted all of them. So none of them have a row span of more than 1. Okay. So, but then we want it to be automatically responsive. We want it so that when we get here, they automatically, collapse appropriately into, the relevant number of sections that can fit the screen size. So I'm going to go back to the larger screen size. And to make that happen, we're going to clear out this column count. And then we're going to choose, Autofeed. Okay. And then for this, I'm going to clear out that 0. So the default unit is 200. That is why they have a minimum width of 200 right now. And that minimum width of 200 allows them to fit into 4. Now we don't want them to be 4. Okay, I want them to be a minimum width of 280. So 280 is an arbitrary number that I've chosen based on the fact that I know that this is the number that will enter a typical website width. Okay, so you have your typical website width to be like 144. Okay, now if you have 280, into 3 places, you have about, let's say our website width is 144. Okay, now I have 280 times 3, so I'm going to subtract 144. So you have about, so if you have 144, you can have this up to, like, say 4 of them perhaps. So I'm going to check my website width here. So I'm going to go to my global settings, width and breakpoint. So what I have is 1120. Okay, so that's my default. So if I have 280 times 3, then I take 1120. So that means I can't have more than 3 because we have exactly 4 of them, but we have to account for the gap. Okay, now if I didn't have any gap, perhaps it would fit into 4. Okay, but I'm gonna have that gap of 20. Now if you have a website width of, let's say, 144 pixel, okay, which I'm not gonna have, then you can say 144 pixel divided by 3. That is gonna give you roughly the number that you're going to put here, but I will advise, don't ever put something like this. You're going to put something smaller than your minimum screen size. Now your minimum screen size is 480, but actual devices can go as low as 360. So if you had, a very wide screen of, let's say, 144, you want to do something like 360, because if you do that times 3, okay, let's say times 3, this is what you're going to get. And if you remove 144 from there, you still have exactly 360, but because you're going to give it gap, it is not going to be, it's not going to be 4. It's not going to be 4 columns. It's going to be 3 columns, because you now have 360 times 4 gives you 144. But then you're not going to have 4 of them because the gaps is taken out of that 360. So what is going to be left remaining is not going to be up to 360. Okay. So because I'm using 1120 width, I'm going to use 280. So this is kind of very technical. The reason you have to really pay attention to what you have here is because if you don't, if I go ahead and put, let's say, 480 here, okay, and then my screen size, my smaller screen size, you see, I'm having an overflow. You can see, because now it's not going to be smaller than that 480. But then I know that my side width can take 280. Then if I go down all the way here, you can see, I'm not going to have that overflow. I mean, even though there is some sort of what looks like an overflow in the builder, it's actually not an overflow as a result of this. Okay, you can see where it stops. Okay, so what I'm going to do is this. So we see that if we go to the next breakpoint, we still have 3 columns. We go here, it changes to 2 columns automatically. If we go here, it changes to 1 column automatically. And then if we go here, it changes to, it still remains 1 column. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to take a look at the front end, and let's see how this looks. So that is automatically responsive. Refresh this. So we have that and that and that. So you can see, even though we have gone even as small as a very small screen size, this is like iPhone SE, which is a very small device, 375 pixel. You can see that we don't have any form of overflow. Everything looks perfect, and it is automatically responsive. So that is how you can set up automatic grid layouts using the Oxygen CSS Grid. Remember, like I said, if you want to set up that automatic layout, don't span, okay? Because it just doesn't make any sense to span the items more than 1 row or 1 column. I mean, possibly you could get away with spanning something, in the row. For example, if I select this first one and span it like, say, 2 rows, okay, Was that the first one? No, it was the second one. Now I span it 2 rows because it's spanning the row. You know, it wouldn't affect the responsiveness. See, it's still, but then, yep. You see, it actually looks good, you know. So, but then it depends on the kind of layout you're going for. But generally, I will keep it simple. I wouldn't span anything for something that I want to be automatically responsive. Now, I know you may have a couple of questions. What about the other things here that we are seeing here? Like this row behavior? You always want to leave this row behavior on auto, okay? Match height of tallest child. I'm going to give you a tip now. Match height of tallest child is sometimes if you're working with using CSS Grid with gallery elements, sometimes in Safari, your items don't show at a smaller screen. They don't show properly. The height is very small. What you want to do is to turn this on. Okay, make sure this is turned on if you're using a gallery element. So the gallery element has a grid layout and you're going to have this same interface. Always make sure you turn this on, maybe at a certain breakpoint, maybe even at the lower breakpoint. Maybe if you get to a lower breakpoint, okay, if it's not showing properly, turn that on and it's going to fix height issues with your grid items. And like I said, leave this on auto. If you change this to explicit, it really doesn't make, to be frank, you're not going to be able to do much with this. Okay, so auto works. I've never come across a situation where I need to use this explicit row behavior. Never come across it. And also, if you want to learn some more advanced techniques on how to use the CSS grid to make an overlapping card, okay, alternating overlapping layout, take a look at this video. I'm going to link it at the top right corner and it's going to appear at the end of this video on the card. So take a look at it. It's going to show you some more advanced technique on how to use the Oxygen CSS grid to make some more advanced layouts. Until next time, have a great day. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Bye.